Welcome to the We Build Academy podcast. If you are thinking about building your dream home, you have come to the right place. We try to demystify the home building process to help you to build your dream home. Now introducing your host, Ryan Watt.
Hi, welcome to the third episode of the We Build Academy podcast. So this week we're speaking to an architect who's actually self-built her own Passivhaus accredited home with her husband. So we'll be talking a lot about the process of going through and why she went through the process of getting actually Passivhaus accredited. And she has some great sort of tips as well from her experience as well. So let's get started.
Okay, so my name's Ruth Butler. I'm an architect and I have been for about 20 or more years. I'm also a registered client advisor. So I do a lot of consultancy with public sector bodies, helping them get the briefs right for their buildings. In my career, I've covered almost every sector, but not too much residential actually, until I decided to build my own house. Before then, my focus was on education, health, community, leisure.
Okay, that's great. And in terms of your physical sort of practice, how many are there within your sort of umbrella, if that makes sense?
Okay, so I've gone from being part of a practice of 200 architects, then to 50, and I'm now down to the grand total of 1. Okay. So what you see is what you get. I'm basically a sole practitioner. I run my own business. I collaborate with other local practices if I need extra resource or design review, but predominantly it is just me.
Yeah, I kind of use the same sort of business model and I find once you get to a certain period, you know a lot of people and you know a lot of experts, and you can go to them when you need to go to them, and rather than having them on your books. But that's great. So if we can just move on to sort of your sort of expertise and your sort of experience. I think before we were talking about that you built your own sort of home and being an architect. If you can just explain a little bit about the sort of process you went through and any sort of just generally how you went about it, and sort of any tips you'd actually like to portray.
Yeah, so I guess being an architect, I'd always been interested in building my own home, and I'd always considered that to be a sort of bit of a pinnacle, really, to be able to control one's own design of one's own environment. And it runs in the family a little bit, because my husband's also in the building industry, and he's a building services engineer. Between us, we'd always had an interest in low energy design, and we all our lives have been focused on that sort of aspect of the profession. So we were very keen when we found a plot of land, which of itself was not a straightforward task. We were very keen to make sure it was exemplary in terms of the low energy build. So we have developed between us an expertise in Passivhaus as a result.
Okay. I think the biggest stumbling block a lot of people say is that there is no land to build on. I mean, you did touch on it then. I mean, how did you physically find your sort of plot? Is there any sort of tips you could sort of pull out from your experience of finding it?
Yes. I don't necessarily agree that there's no land to build on, actually, but what I do think is that the land that's there is quite complicated and quite difficult looking, and I think that puts a lot of people off. So for me and my creative brain, the more difficult the better, because the more challenging the site, the better the design had to be to achieve what we wanted to achieve. So we were very lucky in one regard, in the fact that the site we built on, we found through the local estate agent that just had it advertised. So, Rightmove, prime location, I can't remember which one of those, has got a little land box, and you can tick the land box, and up come a number of sites, all of which look rather difficult and complicated, but we found one basically in a location that we were interested in. Having said that, before that, we had an interest in a plot. There was a backyard development, which we got planning permission on. But because of the constraints of planning, we realised through the process we wouldn't be able to build the type of property that we were interested in living in.
Okay.
So we got permission on it, sold it on, and used the money, the profit we made from that, to roll into the build that we're currently living in.
Okay, so I think that, as you said, is that you do need to make a bit of a compromise on some land, and if you can get the complicated ones that other people don't want to, I think you're probably great in terms of you can see pull out the potential from the land. Is there any sort of when would you think about approaching an architect? I mean, obviously you knew yourself, but I mean, from the sort of experience in terms of, would you try and get one on board, or at least consult one on before buying your land, or you bought your land and then found out you wouldn't actually achieve what you actually wanted to, and then you actually had to move on to the next land? I mean, is there? Well,
we didn't actually buy the plot. We had an option to purchase. So through a clever bit of legal paperwork, we got the planning permission, bought and sold on the same day. So we weren't. Our money wasn't at risk. Through that process.
So you went through the option.
An option of an option agreement.
An option. Yes. So I think that's the key thing also to understand, is you don't actually have to physically buy the plot of land. You can agree with the landowner that if you get planning permission, you're going to buy it at an X amount. If you do get the planning permission, you can take ownership from it, or if I fell through, as you said, you don't really have your money on the table. You only just got your skills and expertise at the time, but that's at risk really. But that's it. So in terms of, once you've got your plot of land, you obviously went down the route of Passivhaus. Is there any particular, obviously being sort of eco-credentials, is there a particular, have you had any experience with Passivhaus before that particular time, or what made you actually go down that route?
So part accident, part knowledge, but we set off wanting it to be low energy, and we'd heard a rumour about Passivhaus, which we thought sounded far too serious for us, and potentially very expensive. And so we weren't going to do that at all. But happily, because we've got the skills between my husband and I, we were able to just sort of take the design that we knew we wanted, pass it through what they call the Passivhaus planning package. It's just a really big Excel document, basically, and test it. And when we tested it, we were surprised to learn that if we just changed the windows to triple glazed and a better performing unit, that we would be able to be compliant. So getting the right advice, I mean, obviously we got the in-house the right advice, but getting architects, and if you're interested in sustainable building, then the right type of consultants on board early allows you to test your design, tweak it, and decide what sort of level, what performance you wish to go for. So we liked the idea of Passivhaus because it's a quality control mechanism. It means that you're not just saying you're going to be low energy, you can prove it. And it controls the whole build process as well. And from a sort of marketing and hearts and minds point of view, it gave the builder something to buy in. They were very sort of keen to achieve it. They knew what was required of them to achieve it. They got quite excited about the build. It gave us something to focus on. It basically gave us a reason to do everything. Whereas I think if we just said we're going to be low energy, but that window looks a bit expensive, let's just go double glaze, not triple, or forget about insulated frames, or whatever technical issues were coming up that day. I think you just get watered down. And in the construction industry, there's an enormous problem about the sort of performance gap between what you think you're designing to and how buildings actually perform when you've finished. You're living in them. So we didn't want a performance gap. And Passivhaus promises no performance gap.
A bit interesting. Is there any particular reason why you didn't want to go down sort of Code for Sustainable Homes, or is that or the equivalent at the time, or is Passive? What made you think about the two? Is it just that it just seemed to be a better fit, or you didn't really weigh up that option?
They're not comparable. Code for Sustainable Homes does something that's very different from Passivhaus. So it's endlessly complicated in the world of green architecture, and there's endless numbers of options. The planning authority, were interested in Code for Sustainable Homes, but because we had decided that the better route for us was Passivhaus, they completely relaxed about their requirements. Our certification was enough to
tick satisfy them. Because code goes into a lot more than just the building. It goes into other areas around the building, your ecology and all that jazz. And it does a lot.
And we did all that as well, but not to the point where we got any sort of certificate to prove it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the one key point I think you highlighted literally is that the one biggest advantage of actually having for Passivhaus is that you all had a common goal to actually achieve something, and it was a way of uniting the design team, the builder, and everybody else in the project, and everybody was aiming for a common goal. I mean, I don't know, in some projects I've been involved in, it does start feeling like it's the build team versus the design team sometimes, and having a common goal, it actually is, I imagine, was very useful to have. So once you're actually physically on site, did you actually have a problem finding your builder to? I mean, you said he was great to, or she at least, they were great to actually get the ball rolling. But did you have problems finding them?
So. Again, luckily, being in the construction industry, I know the local builders quite well. Okay. And although I had only just moved down to this area, so I did have to get to know them quite well, quite fast. But I guess I can tell a good one from a bad one just by a quick conversation over a coffee. I drank a lot of coffee, talked to a lot of builders, and found one who had never heard of Passivhaus before, so they didn't come with any relevant experience. But what was clear to me is that they had the right attitude. And I'd say this, the attitude of your team is absolutely critical, really. You've got to feel that the person at the top of each organisation you're dealing with is you're able to pick up the phone to them, let them know if there's any problems, and they've got the right attitude, they're going to sort it out for you.
So in terms of once you got them on board, what sort of contract did you go under? Is it just did you put together a sort of tender pack and then detailed design tender pack, or was it more of a design and build? What was the sort of?
So I did two things that are quite unusual, and I did them in the knowledge of being able to accommodate the risk that they presented. So first of all, I drew everything before getting a price. Okay. So I had a pack of drawings, 3 inches thick. Now, if you'd gone out to tender on that, well, half of the people you go out to tender on to wouldn't even return your telephone call, let alone the others are thinking of some very big numbers, about the same as the weight of your document. So
that's normally what you do is put it on a scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine would not have passed the scale test. So I drew everything first, and then I went into partnership under a JCT prime contract cost contract with the builder in order to allow them to price the document, price all the work. So I didn't go out to tender. I went to one contractor and we did prime cost contracting.
Oh, that's quite interesting. So if you weren't obviously like an architect, you probably wouldn't have known about any of these sort of the contracts. So I mean, there are either you would approach an architect or someone called a quantity surveyor to advise you on your best sort of contract. It is all, as you say, it's depending on your level of risk certainty as well. The way you went was you found a good builder you understood that they actually were going to do a decent job, and also had the confidence that they weren't going to inflate their costs, and then you presented a good sort of way of then pricing it. It would be quite interesting. Your husband, what did he actually put together in terms of his sort of the building services? I mean, I'm a bit biased, but I mean, in terms of, it'd be interesting to know what he
so
put together.
Rather unusually, he did an awful lot of work on the building services as well. So we had full layout drawings for all the building services, and we specified every item of kit. So nothing was left to the choice of the main contractor. We didn't say we want an MVHR, a mechanical ventilation and heat recovery unit. We said we want this one, mechanical ventilation and heat recovery unit, the size of which we know fits in the plant room we've allocated for it. And when it came to the ductwork design, the trades, the suppliers can't do that. So basically we did it for them and told them what the answer was. So we were very heavily involved, and the prime contract, prime cost contract gave us that degree of control. So we only ever paid the contractor for his labour and anything that he bought. All that was invoiced, and then we paid him a fee on top of that to cover his overheads and profit. He knew he was never going to lose money on the job, and we knew that every time he spent some money, we had complete control over what he spent the money on, and we didn't ever argue about quality. There's no cost cutting.
That's the thing. So your tender came back on budget, then, I take it?
Yes, it did. Yeah, and we managed the process through. The house cost what we knew it would cost at the beginning. That's not to say it didn't go up a bit, but we did choose to gild a couple of lilies. But it wasn't, it was our choice. We could have said, no, don't do that. But for example, the garden walls, I went and chose a handmade brick for the garden walls because it was just much more beautiful than other types of brick. Now, most people wouldn't maybe not care about bricks, but I know I care about bricks.
So. Sometimes being an architect, you probably know too much as well. So,
a little too fussy.
You want to make it perfect. In terms of, but I'll move on to the building site in a minute. But in terms of the contract, sort of, did you have a level of a contingency set aside for your for your costing, or were you quite close to the wind on this one?
So we absolutely built to the budget. We didn't have contingency, but what we did have was, how to describe it, like a menu of things that we didn't have to do, or that we could make savings on. So we had two phases. We determined two phases so that we could keep control of the cost of the first and then reconsider cost for the second. So the first phase was the envelope and the base build, and the second phase was the fit out. And we had a number of options within that would allow us to reduce costs if we found they were escalating somewhere else.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that a lot of people misunderstand is that when you go out to tender, you get a price back. You don't physically have to build what comes back. As you said, what we call it is a value engineering schedule. And then you have a sort of drop dead date of when that decision needs to be made, and you can react to what's happened on site. I mean, a lot of people suggest that they spend at least 50% of their contingency getting out of the ground, and once they're out of the ground, at least then all knowns are pretty well. Hopefully, all your unknowns or knowns are there. But that's generally the thing. So once they're physically on site and they're coming to sort of halfway through the build, I think what's a little bit different to on Passivhaus buildings, they get have a bit more testing at nearer the end. Would you like to just explain a little bit more about the sort of what as a client, what sort of things you need to take consideration coming to near the end of your construction?
So you air test 3 times for Passivhaus as opposed to only once for building regulations. Our house
that they get done just once.
Well,
there is some debate that ever gets done properly.
Yeah, there's that as well.
Yeah.
Our house structure was prefabricated, so it came on the back of a lorry from Austria. It's a timber cross laminate timber structure, and it was erected in just 4 days. So the build itself was only 7 months long, so it was quite a fast build for a new build house. And towards the end, apart from the air testing and the continual sort of check of quality issues on site, there was nothing really very unusual about the build. We were in a big rush at the end, and we were trying to move in before the kitchen was in. I think that's normal for most builds.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people still a little bit dubious about the costing of a prefab. You went down that route for costs or just practical measures or time? I mean, what was your sort of main sort of motivation for it?
The main motivation was that we wanted a timber frame for environmental reasons. Okay. And cross-laminated timber is naturally airtight. You just have to tape each joint. So it's big slabs of timber, and all you have to do is run some tape along a joint. So it made life easier, and it was very quick, and we're absolutely surrounded by neighbours here. So I didn't want the neighbours to have to put up with a very prolonged build period. Mm-hmm. And so time is money. The structure cost about £60,000, which I think was excellent value for money, actually, given it did the airtightness naturally. Yes. It gives us a nice self-finished building with no need to paint the walls. And
I was going to say, your walls look lovely. Actually. Just put some artwork on it, and that's fine. But no.
Yeah.
So sorry, I cut you off there. My apologies.
That's right.
That's the thing I always find a bit weird is that the construction industry is about the only one that moans about doing things in a factory and saying it's not cost effective. And I think, as you say, you had to get your pack from Europe. So there wasn't really any sort of options in the UK at the actual time. But so when you're coming to the end of that build, you put it all together. You said you needed to just air test it, obviously commission all the systems properly. But once when do you physically start getting certification, the certificates and stuff like that, a little bit over and above?
Yeah, it's quite a big process at the end because you need to verify everything. So you've been taking photographs of all the junctions as the build goes together. Every time there's something to be seen, you take a photograph of it. Mm. But the process of certification really starts at the beginning. When you do your PHPP, and then it has to be approved by a Passivhaus certifier, and you march on. Mm-hmm. And at the end, all you're doing is proving that you built what you said you were going to build. So you're issuing certificates and photographs and updating the Passivhaus planning package if anything changed. You submit it all back to the Passivhaus certifying authority, and we used Warm. They're probably one of the better known people in the country, and it takes them a month. It then goes to Germany, and they ask some really, really searching technical questions. Okay. Which so you need the right expertise in your team. They're not the sort of questions that even I could answer, but I passed them on to somebody that could. Then the Germans ask their questions because they're looking after the standard worldwide. Yeah. And then finally they say, "Yep, you're absolutely right. You have built a Passivhaus here. Have a piece of paper."
That's cool. Did you get one of those plaques to put on the side of your wall?
Yeah, a piece of plastic. Here, have a piece of paper and a piece of plastic.
Yeah, I always found it ironic sometimes when you have to use lots and lots of paper and all that jazz just to be green. So in terms of the moving forward with the Passivhaus, once you've actually taken ownership and an occupancy of it, is there anything? Does it stop there, or is there any other things you are doing post completion?
It didn't stop there for us, but that's because we're sort of slightly geeky around these things. So we've been doing energy monitoring, internal air quality monitoring, temperature, humidity monitoring. So we've been doing that for 3 years now. Okay. And every year we publish the latest findings online. We've also published how much the build costs and how much the Passivhaus element of the build costs online. So we're interested in feeding back to the community the learning that we've had on this project, and so we do a lot of monitoring. I mean, I can tell you that even against the rather harsh requirements of Passivhaus, the building is 35% more efficient than we had expected it to be.
Okay, so there's your gap, but in a positive way.
Gap closed.
So that's in a good gap.
Yes.
I mean, I think a lot of people also, in terms of energy, is that it is dependent on how you use your building. You know, if you are very energy conscious, you know all these energy models have to take an assumption of how you're going to use the building. I think the occupant can make a huge difference to how you use your building. You know, if you keep your windows open or keep your lights on all the time, you know, compared to someone who just turns it all off. But no, what's interesting about the air quality, have you actually, in terms of the results, obviously it's providing a very good environment for yourself compared to, well, not compared, but I mean, you know, you have no sort of issues at the moment with your house?
No, when we first started monitoring the air quality, we thought there was something wrong with the monitor because there was virtually no reading. So we thought, right, we'll open the front door, we'll flush the house through, and we'll reset the monitor. So we opened the front door, and the monitor went absolutely crazy because we're surrounded. Or not, but there are some people in the local area that use some of these, you know, the wood fire burners that are so popular at the moment. And this was in November we were doing this, so they had their fires on. And so, I mean, what it proves to me is that the air quality inside, because of the mechanical ventilation and heat recovery system, is just very much healthier than what you're breathing outside in terms of particulates.
I mean, that's just what I'm thinking of, is in terms of just reflecting back over the whole process, is that you actually started from a very good level of design quality from day one, and you actually found that actually achieving the Passivhaus wasn't dramatic. And I think a lot of people, in my mind, the level of quality that is the bare minimum and doesn't necessarily, if you're building your own sort of dream home, I would not really recommend that. But when you two are both professionals and you understand what's the sort of the best way to do things, the gap between what you wanted to do and actual Passivhaus wasn't actually dramatic. And I think that's why some people get a bit blurry-eyed when they see Passivhaus. Oh, you need to do all this. Actually, I think it's a great standard because it's literally forces you to build a decent quality building, and I think as what you're saying, you're actually building a building now has actually got better indoor air quality than the external at periods of time, and I think that's great. So in terms of moving on to sort of any sort of tips, if you weren't an architect, and if you were, and your husband wasn't an engineer, and you were interested in going down sort of a low energy Passivhaus-y route, is there any one sort of major roadblock that that normally you'd hit into, and how can you avoid hitting into that wall?
So I would say you've got to get more expertise into the team earlier. And certainly pre-planning. So a lot of people fixate about the risks of planning because they're worried they won't get it. But I think if you need to, so they minimise their expenditure on consultants before planning. But that, if you want to build low energy buildings, that's a mistake. Don't do that. Get a team on board earlier and use the PHPP tool as a design tool. You don't have to go to for Passivhaus with it. You could decide not to go for certification. You could decide to go for a lesser standard in any way that you feel comfortable with. That's fine. But know why you're making a decision and know what it is you're aiming to achieve, and get that advice in early. And then when you've sort of got a fixed design, the other piece of advice is just don't change your mind. Don't try and make things cheaper. Decide where you're going to spend the money, but make sure that the things you do spend your cash on are the things that matter. They're the fabric of the building. They're the way it performs, and not how super expensive your kitchen fit out might be, or something that might change again in 10 years' time. Something that you can modify.
find the money later on in life and you know, buy the kitchen you want in 10 years time, or, you know, it's just you know, you can those sort of things can be retrofitted. Obviously your building fabric can't, so or easily. Okay, and so in terms of one sort of final tip, if we could just literally just narrow it down to say one sentence, what would your main key sort of thing would be?
For a successful build, I think it's about the team. So spend your time getting the team right. Don't be afraid to interview different architects. Get to the bottom of understanding where they're coming from, what gets them excited. Is it what makes you excited as well? And your builder, make sure they've got the right attitude. They may not have all the skills you need in one place, but if they've got the right attitude, we took ours on a training course. We went and learnt together. So, you know, give yourself a team that you can learn through the process, have got the right attitude towards learning. So,
sounds like you had a kind of ideal sort of project overall. I mean, was it quite smooth all the way through? Is it you had any sort of major sort of roadblock on that particular?
It was quite smooth, and I hate to say it because I know a lot of people go through horrible times with self builds, and you can hear some quite poor stories out there. It was smooth. When we first started and we were digging in the ground, and the ground's contaminated on this site, and it was complicated in the ground. I at that point, I wasn't absolutely sure everything was going to go well, because I had a man knee deep in mud trying to lay insulation into the mud before he poured the concrete, which is something he'd never ever done before in his entire career. And I had a bunch of Germans coming over, well, Austrians to be fair, testing the levelness of that slab that had been poured in the mud, in order to put whether it was good enough to put the timber frame on, because they had an opinion about that. So at times where you're trying to marry expectations and things in the ground on this particular build, there were moments there where I wasn't sure it was going to go very smoothly. But happily we got over that.
It sounds like you had quite a smooth project, but I mean, obviously you gave your builder a very good sort of pack of information early on so they can digest it and actually, or at least flick through it properly and having the thing. But no, thank you for your time. We're just going to round off. What I was quite interested to do is, with your data, where would be the best place for someone to go and have a look at it? You said you publish on that. Where do you publish that?
Mostly on LinkedIn. So if you look for me on LinkedIn, or look for Julian Sutherland. That's my other half, and he publishes on LinkedIn. He's a partner at Cundall, which are an engineering company in town. So Julian Sutherland at Cundall, or Ruth Butler at Ruth Butler Architects on LinkedIn, and you should be able to find it there.
All right, and just a final sort of thought. So you mentioned you're an architect, but the sort of projects you get involved with is not residential as per se. It's a bit more. What did you discuss? It was a bit more community based. Community based. So if you're anyone who is requiring an architect, please feel free to get in touch with her. And thank you again for your time.
I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, please feel free to get in contact with me. I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you haven't yet ordered your free self-build starter pack, please visit our website at webuildacademy.com to order your free pack there. It's full of tips and tricks and other useful bits of kit in that. And also we'll be able to keep you up to date when we're issuing some more podcasts like this one. So next episode, we're going to be talking to a Passivhaus accredited sort of designer, an architect who is a specialist in Passivhaus. We'll be talking the difference about Passivhaus and actually Passivhaus Premium, and giving some examples of what that actually means and in example projects. So please make sure you don't miss out on that one. So again, thank you for your time, and very much appreciated spending time and watching our podcast. Thank you.